So we live in a country in which we all have a legacy. And that legacy is that our country was founded on a notion that all men are created equal. But the founding fathers who wrote those words and who spoke those words, many of them were slave owners. And we still live in a country where the legacy of slavery is very much with us. We just had a conversation which the editor of the Community News says that when he walks into a store, he feels a certain way, but that Black people feel different when they walk into a store. We live in a country in which we still see the legacy in terms of massive incarceration. We still see it in terms of the line between the suburbs and the inner city. Should we teach our children about slavery, given its terrible legacy? If we do not teach them, how do we end that legacy? My name is Donald Jones. I'm professor of law at the University of Miami, and I'm here to talk about this important issue with a distinguished colleague, Professor David Abraham of the University of Miami School of Law, a brilliant man who has also taught history at Princeton, and someone with whom I've had many a cup of coffee. We're here today to talk about this important subject. We may not always agree, but it should be lively and thought-provoking. Let me begin by asking Professor David Abraham, what is your favorite song?
What is my favorite song? Well, as our lead-in, I thought that I still haven't found what I'm looking for is a testimony both to the incompleteness of successes that we've scored and the need to keep on trucking, keep on struggling to find what we're looking for, a more just and equal world. And we're both academics, teachers, so we try to do that with students. We're also citizens of this country, and we try to engage in the politics that would bring us closer to what we're looking for.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And David, let me say, just to try to bring our audience into this so we're all on the same page, that when that recently the Florida legislature has passed a law to make it illegal for teachers to use critical race theory. What they were focusing on clearly was the fact that a number of teachers have tried to use in their lesson plan the critical race theory to teach slavery. And what they're teaching is not just what happened in slavery, but its legacy. And so we want to talk about this issue. And I'm here to talk about, because I think what's called critical race theory, which we're going to call CRT, is a scapegoat. And that the real question here, I think, is the question of erasure. I think that there are people who would like us either not to look at or to erase a part of our history. And I think that in order to avoid, George Santayana says, those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think if we don't teach our children about this aspect of our past, however ugly it is, how do we keep our society from repeating the mistakes that are part and parcel of the legacy of slavery? So to talk about this, I'm going to turn the microphone over in a rare move to Professor Abraham, and I'm going to let you be sort of my raconteur, and I want to try to help us to take apart this thorny question.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have some dialogue on this issue. You quoted Santayana. We could quote a white son of the South who reminds us at Faulkner that history isn't past. History isn't over. It's not even the past.
Right.
And
the past is not past.
The past is not past. The past is very much with us. Now, the conflict over teaching slavery, I think we should make clear to anyone who's joined us today, is not about the fact that there was slavery. We are not in the historical period anymore where it's plausible to create a happy Stephen Foster mythology of
happy
the plantation
slaves
and slavery and happy slaves. Rather, the people who are vexed and engaged on this issue want us to teach that the aftermath of slavery is behind us, and that we can discuss slavery as the deep past. And obviously, I think we would agree that's not the case. There are lots of things, not only about slavery, but in some ways, more importantly than the question of working for somebody else for nothing, the destructiveness that slavery and Jim Crow and its most recent versions have brought and built into the system of American life, economics, politics, society. But I want to take us on a little side trip for a moment, which is why now? Why here? Why now? We have known about many of these things, pushed them aside. Some things like the police assassination of George Floyd and the other acts of police
violence. The murder of George Floyd.
The murder of George Floyd and some of the other police assassinations and murders that took place around the same time kind of threw fuel on this fire. But I want to take us in
the fire now. Since James Baldwin had a book, called "The Fire Next Time."
Yeah, it's now.
I think this is the fire now. Yeah. But if I can jump in here, I think one of the things that happened when the murder of George Floyd took place and the murder of Daunte Wright and so many other, Breonna Taylor, was that this was a moment where, for a moment, there was catharsis. There was an identification of majority of people, black and white, that there was a huge injustice that was taking place, and there was something deep in the root of our society that had to be rooted out. And then for a moment, I think it was almost as if we are the world. We became part of this image, but that only lasted a second, and then polarization set in. And I think people began to be afraid. And I think one of the problems you have is that when people get afraid, there's always someone who's going to be vigilant enough to exploit that fear. And as I see it, CRT is really a name for a movement which was started in 1989, which I was a part of. Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and they created this movement, and it was a movement to try to understand why the law was so often the handmaiden of racism, not just in the past, but today. And that movement, which was very much infused with the images of the civil rights movement, has now been demonized. As you hear people like Pence saying, well, it's Marxist or it's hateful.
Sure.
And so now that has this CRT has become like forced busing. And so if you add CRT to something, that makes it bad. And so now they want to suggest that somehow the teaching of slavery is somehow tied into, it's almost like they can take a rubber band and make CRT into a rubber band and stretch it to whatever they want.
Yeah. So I want to get back to why that campaign against CRT is so successful. Let me start though with the recent verdict from Georgia and the Arbery murders.
Yes,
this is a kind of feel good. I mean, I think the verdicts are correct, but when we can identify racism about being three white guys in a pickup truck with guns who shoot completely innocent joggers, then we can get a huge consensus around that. Probably even our Florida governor probably thinks that was a very terrible thing that happened.
Right. Fringe elements.
Yeah, but that's the image of racism that a broad swath of the country can live with. Three guys in a pickup truck with a shotgun, right? But the notion that in our very society that this racial discrimination, racial animus is built in, that's much tougher. And that's what CRT starts to explore. Now, why does the campaign against CRT have the legs and the force that it has? So here I want to say something that you might disagree with some. But I think
we've disagreed before.
Yeah, let's maybe do it again. So years ago, a sociologist, Todd Gitlin by name, said, while the left was busy conquering the English department, the right was conquering the state legislatures. And saying the English department is a little bit too narrow, but I do think one can say that many of the cultural institutions of the United States, and including corporations for that matter, adopted a broader vision of discrimination and what racism is and the like, and successfully found the university and cultural institutions a beachhead for these more established institutions. But when a counter mobilization took place, we had very little defense of those advances in state governments, boards of education, and the like. I mean, maybe in the San Francisco Board of Education, the progressives or the liberals were strong enough to change the name of Dianne Feinstein High School and Abraham Lincoln High School, and to paint over murals that cosmetic stuff that doesn't cost any money. Paint over murals from the 1930s, which ironically were produced by communist artists who were part of the international social realist movement.
I call it symbolic capital.
Of course, it's
not money. It's
it's symbolic. But then once you leave place the few islands where liberals or the left are in control, it was just enough to put this stuff in the air and enable right-wing and conservative politicians to say, see what they're doing. They are tearing up the promise of America and saying it's in the DNA of America to be racist. And that means it's not just the Confederacy that was racist. It was not just even Woodrow Wilson that was racist. It's your kids who are racist, and it's us, and we got to fight back against this.
And CRT becomes the boogeyman in this. But if I can jump in on this, you see, I think one of the problems we have at the root of this is that we have a simplistic concept of what race is. So, for example, I think our ideas about race are really based on what happened in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, you had the 3 men in a pickup truck, and they murdered people. They put chains around a black person's legs and they dragged him through the streets and so forth. These were lynchings. And so the idea it still persists that it's the Confederates or the white supremacists who, and some people want to demonize all Republicans and all that. And so I think that the tragedy is that racism is much deeper. It's not just the 3 men in the pickup truck. It's not just the sheriff who with the bullwhip or the white Klansman with the torches. It's racism is, in the first instance, an ideology. It's a set of ideas and stories and narratives. And those narratives are embedded, first of all, in our culture. It's in TV. It's in the way we teach history. It's in the way we structure laws. So, for example, the drug war has become largely a racial project. It has become a project in which we have military campaigns against predominantly people of color communities in the inner city. And I think that that's a horrific tragedy especially when blacks and whites use cocaine at statistically identical rates. When we focus on cocaine and we don't focus on opioids, people use cocaine are called criminals. People use opioids are people who need, rehabilitation. And so, and what you find is that race is not merely hate. Race becomes like a label. We have raced crime. Crime defines race, and race defines crime. And so race is something deeper. It is something that's part of our culture, and then that culture then seeps and crystallizes in the form of laws and policies. And then so it's not that police are not the problem, they are, but the problem goes deeper. It goes into the policies and laws in which racism is crystallized. And also it fits within the structure of our society itself. I think that if we ask the question, at one point, and one part of the Constitution was that blacks counted for 3/5 of a man. Blacks now earn probably 3/5 of what whites earn. And so it's that structural racism, that structural inequality that's driving and perpetuating many of the divisions in our society.
Well, I think we can agree that for the most part, we are past the notion of racism as hatred, and do understand that there are issues, some of which I think are broadly understood. Redlining in mortgage lending, for example, is an issue I think where in the last decades there has come to be an understanding of that is a racial issue.
Yes.
There are other things that I think have arisen that have to be seen in a kind of contradictory and dialectical way. There has been a movement of a significant part of the Black population from the urban to the suburban landscape. Not that every suburb is an idyllic. I mean, a lot of suburbs are poor and have bad schools and the rest. But the focus on the urban inner city as a place that has to be supervised militarily with all these recycled weaponry from the Middle East and elsewhere is a sign that part of the population has been extruded. And that population overwhelmingly, almost entirely Black, and has no prospects and need have no prospects because it's going to be policed and simply policed. That happens at the same time that other portions of Black population have come to enjoy some more opportunities. And it would be, I think, mistaken to equate those situations. There's racism in both, but the racism of the militarily policed inner city is not the racism confronted in middle-class parts of Washington, D.C.
There's no question.
Or South Miami.
But I mean, this is part of what I write about. I think that what's happened is that we still have a color line or the equivalent of it. You know, in the past, the color line was black and white. Now you have blacks on both sides. Now, I think what happens is that people are raced. Race isn't simply something that you're born with. It's no longer just black and white. Another way to think about it is race has become a spectrum. At one end is someone who's very wealthy, who has a beautiful house, who may have gone to Harvard. Just imagine Obama, imagine Oprah, imagine some of the ball players. But then the people who are in the inner city, who are Black and who live in a certain place where the military campaigns are targeted, that is a different world and a different experience. Black means something much more different there. And so I think what's going on is this: people are raced and they are racialized, and we've racialized the Blackboard. Whereas the people who may have the Harvard degree, it's almost as though they are no longer othered in the same way, or at least not as systemically. So race doesn't have a constant meaning. It's a meaning that changes based on where you live and the zip code you live in. It also changes based on the way you present culture. If I came in and I always often wonder what would happen if I came into school and I had on a hoodie, twisty braids, and a lot of tattoos. How long could I keep my job? I don't know, but I don't think tenure would protect me. And I think that that what's happened is we have erased race for most formal purposes, but we racialize culture. And so all of these things are happening at once. So in the post-civil rights era, you can arrest someone simply because they wear saggy pants and a hoodie. And we don't think of that as racist. And there's something wrong there. But I think part of slavery has been this idea of caste. And the genius of racism is that it figures out a way to maintain racial caste just by changing around some of what the categories are.
I'm a bit uncomfortable with the caste analogies because the problems faced by Nicole Hannah-Jones are not the problems faced by some young folks down the street here in South Miami.
I couldn't agree more.
And the caste analysis tends to put everybody from Oprah to the kid down the street.
She's not in the caste I'm talking about.
The same caste. Well, but that's the meaning of caste. You're born into it, and it's fixed, and it's inherited.
No. That's not. See, in other words, this is what I think they've done. I think that historically, yes, that is what it is meant. But I think that today, the way the othering mechanism goes, I'm going by how you're treated. The way that people are treated is something like this. I can go into Joe's Stonecraft, at least if I'm dressed like this. If I had twisty braids, tattoos, I may have to give them the waiter outside $50 to let me in. So that's what I'm talking about. If I wear this hoodie and saggy pants, I may come out of my house and I'm going to go away to the store. I may not, like Philando Castile, get to the store. But
And
you
this
see,
is the
on the
lesson
other,
of the Trayvon Martin story. I mean,
right?
there's no question that um, the indicia of
Yes,
being subjected to racist
yes,
treatment are manifest in many ways. I mean, we know that in most public spaces, black men have more trouble than black women. We
yes,
know that dress is an index of how people will be treated in certain black people will be treated in certain settings. These things are all true, and there is an extent to which all black people are in the same boat together.
yes.
There's an extent in which racism affects black people in disparate ways. So let me take one
I think we're
statistic.
agreeing. You see,
Yeah, no, I think we are agreeing. We may have to think about. We may think differently. We'll see in a few minutes about remedial
right?
approaches. So one statistic that you hear a lot, and I wish I had the precise numbers with me today. I don't. That the average white person has 6 times the resources, 6 times the assets, 6 times the income of white people. But when you disaggregate that and take into account the absolute inequality within the United States, it turns out if you scrape off the top 2% of white people, the number goes from 7 to 3. Now, it's a very, very bad thing that the
Right.
median white person has 3 times the income or assets of the median black person, but it's not 7 times. And we have to factor that inequality in. So that inequality within the total population, within the white
No, I
population.
understand what you're saying. You can't paint with too broad of a brush. And I think what people often tend to do is as we was talking earlier, they're whites who really are not privileged in terms of wealth. And I think that to lump everyone together, I think and I think what the Republicans have succeeded in doing is tapping into the frustration from many whites, and there's tremendous income inequality between whites and between the white working class. And so they're able to plug into the angst of the white working class. Now, of course,
absolutely,
I would argue that the white working class is fantastically more privileged than blacks. I don't think, for example, that they're going to have a tank rolling down the streets of a trailer park and say, we want everyone to come out and empty your pockets and lay on the ground. When I first came to Miami, that's what I watched. They'd gone to Overtown. The police rolled up in SWAT teams, and everybody who lived in that project, who walked out, they told them, lay on the ground, empty your pockets, and they searched them. It was a systemic abuse. It was like Fourth Amendment apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not what I think happens in predominantly white communities.
Well, I mean, yes and no. Again, police violence is not an area in which I would call myself a specialist, but some scholars, Barbara Fields, African-American scholar at Columbia, has analyzed the statistics of police murders of innocent civilians, and this is not something from which white people are immune.
No, true.
The numbers are disproportionate, but
vastly
the question let's get together and look at these numbers.
Yes.
I mean, vastly is a complicated term, and it's disproportionate to be sure. But it's not exclusively violence that police are entitled to exercise against black people that they don't exercise against white people. Police violence is a function.
But you recognize that race matters a whole lot,
without doubt.
In other words,
without doubt,
and not just in terms of police, in terms of schools, race predicts who is going to be in the classes. What do they call the classes where you have to
the college track versus the vocational
the
track?
Tracking it matters. It matters where you whether you are arrested as a 12-year-old in school.
Absolutely.
So in other words, I still remember there was a police commissioner in New York, and he says, why are you doing the stop and frisk campaign? You're not collecting a lot of guns. You're doing the hit rate was very low. They stopped millions of people literally with maybe they got 20 or 30 guns. And he says, why are you doing this? And he says, he denied saying it. He says, well, we want these kids to know that we're on them from the time they leave the house. Now and I believe in his mind were not some white kid with long hair who lived in the Upper East Side. So in fact, I think that our whole concept of who a criminal is and what a criminal and what drug crime is I think most people probably draw a black guy who looked like Wesley Snipes. You see, so I think that race is real and it's deep. It's not just class.
Well, the racism is real. I mean, whether race is real or even to begin with, separate question. But the racism is real.
But in the last 5 minutes, I think that this is part of why I think we do need to teach slavery, because we do have problems in which I think slavery is mirrored. And I see when I look at, I still remember I saw this movie, and it was a documentary, and there were black people who were walking to the DC jail. The bus would stop, and maybe 20 black men would get off in chains. Another bus 15 minutes later would stop, and black men would get out in chains. For me, I saw a resonance of slavery in that, and I continue to see it, in our court system. And so I think this is part of why I think we need to teach slavery, because its reparations are still with us.
Well, it's reverberations. You used the word reparations. Reverberations. Yes. Well, we'll get to the reparations too, I think. But two things. First, on the crime question. I mean, New York City just elected a black mayor who's not from the Manhattan liberal class.
But then he run as sort of, I'm going to empower the police.
Adams, and his position is we can't just focus on why we consider young black men perpetrators of crime. We have to also focus on the fact that black people across the board are victims of crime, and he may wind up reinstituting
sometimes police crime.
No, I entirely agree. But my point here is that there is support for toughness on crime that runs deep in black working class and black.
Yes, absolutely. That's true.
Communities.
True. Absolutely.
And we will see if a black mayor winds up instituting things that a white mayor had to abandon because of the hostility.
Which is interesting.
We'll see.
If I could say this, and I know we're running out of time, but I went to school with Kurt Smoke, who became the mayor of Baltimore. A good man, good heart, beautiful person. I can't speak more highly of him. And what was interesting, Kurt Smoke, as mayor of Baltimore, presided over the city at a time when they were engaging in military-style campaigns in the inner city based on what's called the war on crime. And in this war on crime, they were arresting people in the black community for things like, well, you're riding a bicycle without a registration, or you're carrying a bottle that's not in a paper bag. And blacks were arrested in incredible disproportion in that setting. And the NAACP and the ACLU sued the city of Baltimore, saying that you are systemically arresting blacks without probable cause. And what was interesting is the city did not contest the lawsuit. They simply decided they would pay the money. And I think that's an incredible commentary that ends in the city. So I think, you see, in past, racism targeted individuals. Now I think one of the modalities of racism is we target communities. Now, it simply so happens, and they call them high crime areas, that high crime areas become this euphemism for the ghetto. And so I think that, you see, that to me is a resonance of slavery. Well, and in many ways, I wonder if the ghetto isn't, some ways, I know hip hop calls ghetto the plantation. It does seem that there is this resonance with.
Well, that
slavery.
is the place where freedmen
Yes.
are most easily policed, as they were in Jim Crow period, after nominally achieving legal freedom after the rapid defeat of Reconstruction. Um, that's what the plantation system was as an economic system
Right.
and as a policing system to control a nominally free but not really free population. I think that's right. And one sees the residue of that in the militarized policing of urban,
Yes.
poorer urban neighborhoods, overwhelmingly Black. I don't think there's any question about that. Uh, when you say, however, let's get to back to where the conservatives and Republicans are scoring their points. Um, when you say teaching slavery,
Yes.
what we really mean
Yes.
is teaching how the repression of Black people became embedded in law, in economics, in education. That's the dangerous part.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the reverberations of slavery. These are the continuations of slavery. That is where the friction point is. We can denounce the far past. Are we willing to look at the present? So the attack on CRT in the schools is an attack on the effort to examine racism in contemporary life.
The legacy
There's
of
no
racism.
question about that.
The legacy.
The active presence of
Yes.
racism in economy, society, and politics. And in some respects,
The past is not past.
The past is certainly not past.
But I want to say this, and this one thing I think is very important. I do believe that there are vast differences between being a Black person who lives in a $500,000 house, or in inflation of today, $5 million houses, and a person who lives in a city. That these are two very different Black experiences. And so for me, I think it's important to understand that, and this idea that all Blacks are now sweltering under the weight of oppression, to me seems to paint over the incredible difference between those two situations.
Well, I think the tough point is when the people articulating the cause are not a mass movement as the civil rights movement was, that involved Black workers and Black churches and Black labor movements, but rather kind of new Black intelligentsia, which is mostly in the media.
Yes.
And is speaking from a position of its own privilege, which the mass of people.
Are you saying that Blacks can be privileged too?
I know you meant that sarcastically, so I won't respond except to say, yes, I mean, that there's been a certain success in the corporate world, in the financial world, in the media world. And those people who are operating through things like diversity, equity, inclusion in the human relations business are not the mass movement of people in the 60s and thereafter who were closely connected to Black working class interests and Black working class needs. I mean, even if we go back to the great civil rights marches, they were for jobs.
Well, I hear you there, and your comments resonate. But I want to say this: isn't it also true? And this is, you use the term dialectic. I wonder if it isn't also true that even if you are someone who lives in a $5 million house, even if you are someone with a Harvard degree, you still, on a daily basis, face the legacy of racism, and you still are subject to being arrested illegally or shot by the police, and you still are victim or vulnerable to stereotypes, particularly if you're a Black woman. I wonder if you would agree that both are true.
Both things operate. I mean, the richest and most successful Jews of Europe, and to extend the United States, were vulnerable to discrimination and exclusion and a raft of other things. But those insults and deprivations were not of the same order. I don't doubt that that middle class Black people, leave aside the Oprahs and the Nicole Hannah Joneses, but working class Black people have achieved a modest measure of success and have a little house and a little savings, and the rest are vulnerable politically and economically, as well as from the police, to treatment that can ruin their lives overnight.
Arguably, Trayvon Martin was middle class.
Yeah, I don't know the economic background, but he certainly was not inner city,
Right.
impoverished inner city family.
But he was wearing a hoodie.
But he was associated in the eyes of Zimmerman and the police with that other world. So yes, there's an extent to which all Black people are in the same boat, but I think the struggle against racism and its impact on 13% of the American population is not most effectively addressed and countered by emphasizing the same boatness of 13% of the population. That struggle needs allies. That struggle needs support.
We do need allies.
And it can't be based simply on the guilty conscience of the white professional class. It needs to be based on broad sectors of the population. So, for example, if Biden's Build Back Better program had not been abandoned, if it had been successful, the attack on critical race theory in the schools of Florida and these other states would not have the traction that it has gotten. The Democratic Party has abandoned working people, and so working people are vulnerable to the rabble-rousing of certain governors and school boards and state legislatures.
Well, I think that there's an issue here, and I wish we had more time. My guest has been Professor David Abraham, professor at the University of Miami School of Law, a colleague and a dear friend. We're going to have to take this further, but our goal is to build a bridge to the future. And the last thing I'm going to say is this, and I think that that bridge can only be built with truth, and that historical truth is critical. We need to share that with our kids, and we should stop building barriers to that through laws that punish teachers for trying to teach it. And we should stop trying to create stereotypes and boogeymen to say that, well, CRT is, we need to get past that and get to the hard business of having this difficult conversation within our schools and as a nation about the continuing legacy of slavery in our lives. My name is Donald Jones. I'm professor of law at the University of Miami. You've been listening to Up Close, and we'll close with, again, the Sweet Honey in a Rock. We're still trying to find it. God bless all of you.
Thanks.